So kind of to just bring us well in full circle, we're going to be talking about building a more equitable and culturally competent workplace, key to successful workforce recruitment and retention. Creating a Colorado that is more equitable and inclusive by working with our team to revamp how your organization recruits, hires, supports, and advances employees of all color. Transforms culture to embrace and aggressively support inclusivity, invest in education and a workforce development to create a skilled and inclusive workforce for the future.
So I have a quick question for you all. Who here does not want to be or does not want to work for an employer of choice? Whew, I'm so glad nobody raised their hand. I didn't know what I was going to do next. So it seems like this is a common aspiration among our workforce. But what does it mean, truly? An employer of choice is distinguished by its commitment to creating a supportive, inclusive, and rewarding work environment. It prioritizes employee well-being, development, and recognition. Such organizations not only attract top talent, but also drive sustained business success and maintaining a strong market reputation. If we want to be an employer of choice, we must focus on building a more equitable and culturally competent workplace. We've all heard of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some organizations have DEI departments. Others offer employee-sponsored courses or trainings, and some may not provide either. Let's break this down. Diversity is representation. Equity is not just equal opportunity, but equitable opportunity. Inclusion is a sense of belonging. That's what we all truly want, right? We want to belong. We want to feel as though we belong. We want to be in a place that our belonging matters. So where do we start? We start by developing cultural competence. That's all of us. We have to look inside of ourselves first before we can truly see others. The ability to understand, communicate with, and effectively interact with people across all cultures. This involves awareness of one's cultural worldview, attitude toward cultural differences, and knowledge of different cultural practices.
So we want to dive into the research and show some factors that affect having a financially stable organization that attract and keep the best talent. When we think about hiring and retention, the words diversity, equity, and inclusion come to mind. Why diverse hiring matters. As we all know, there has been more attention and importance placed on diverse hiring the past 10 years or so. But do we know why? Do we have stats that back up these efforts besides the obvious factor of it's the right thing to do? The answer is yes. The Colorado Inclusive Economy reports that it is in fact very favorable to have equitable and inclusive hiring practices. They found that racially and ethnically diverse companies are 35% more likely to outperform their competitor. 67% of job seekers consider a diverse workforce as an important factor when evaluating companies and job offers. Team collaboration is 57% better in organizations rated highly for D&I. The other factors to consider are, over the past few years, there's been more and more research that supports the need for diversity in the workplace. 1, this may be shocking to some, but if employees feel ignored, unheard, microaggressed, and hindered in their career growth, they'll leave. This is supported by Indeed's study that projects employees across sectors prioritize a sense of belonging over pay in their employment decisions. This is why inclusive and equitable policies in the workplace are so important. 2, employers are gaining experience in diverse ways. According to McKinsey, 65% of the 17 million Black workers in the U.S. develop their skills through pathways other than a bachelor's degree.
So on the next slide, we're going to look at some more stats just from a different viewpoint and lens. So this is a McKinsey report conducted throughout the years that really looks at the relationship between the financial health of your company and representation and leadership, which is very important, as we will see here. So first, I'm going to look at the first plot point. You may not be able to see it, but companies that have women in representation in their executive team have 15% more likelihood to financially outperform their counterparts who do not have that representation. That was in 2015 that was collected. And if we fast forward less than 10 years later in 2023, we see that number go up significantly to 39%. So that shows how the growth is going. You can see an ethnic diversity representation on executive team. You still see that upward trend. So this really demonstrates that diversity on your leadership really matters. It matters even more now that our society is changing and we are having different priorities, and it impacts your bottom line. So if we look at the next slide, we can see that the lack of diversity is actually becoming more expensive for companies as well. So when we look at the far numbers over here, you can see that in the bottom quartile, for those that have the least amount of representation with ethnicity and gender, are 66% less likely to outperform financially than companies that do have that representation. So this really supports the hypothesis that it is a benefit to have diversity on your executive teams, and that this is where the DEI hiring and retention policies are often made. So very important, and I'll pass it to Jamie to explain more.
I'm going to talk about the how, and in doing so, I'm only going to use words that have no numbers. So we're going to frame this up with a term called intersectionality, and intersectionality comes from the 90s. Kimberly Crenshaw is a fantastic scholar of critical race theory. And over on the left-hand side, you can see parts from the original term and how she coined this term. This is her term. And she was talking specifically about the intersection for Black women between their race and their gender. Now, we've expanded this greatly and utilized this term over time, right? This is like a common term we all know. So if you look up on the right side at the top, take a look at that chart. Take a look at the characteristics and identity types that are identified there, and do a little self-reflection. Where do you find intersections in your own identity? How do those amplify your privilege? How do those amplify your oppression? How do those make you just a squishy person that has all sorts of ups and downs, ins and outs that's different from everybody else? Now think about the people you work with, your immediate colleagues. Think about the people that you manage. Remember that they all have their own identities as well that are squishy just like yours. And we've done so many ladder metaphors today and shown you so many broken rungs. It's important. I'm glad to reinforce this. Something that I'd like to point out here is, where's the career ramp, right? So even these metaphors we use can be ableist in nature. So that's why I include this here. And this is to frame up a conversation starting with hiring. So I'm going to pass it on to Stephanie to talk about that.
No, we've talked a lot about vetting hiring practices and ensuring we're up to date with inclusive practices. So it's time for action. These steps help organizations and individuals mitigate gender, racial, and other hidden biases. So number one, before you begin, identify the criteria for a successful search. For example, when focused on hiring across identities, the National Football League mandated that any team with a head coaching vacancy must interview at least one person of color before making a hire. Candidates of color were 19 to 21% more likely to fill a head coaching vacancy. Research shows that cluster hiring, or hiring multiple employees in one or more departments who share interests and identities, increases both the diversity of the incoming talent pool as well as retention of female staff and staff of color. Number two, use diverse marketing materials and make your commitment to DEI clear. Make sure you have statements in all of your job postings, also on your website and jobs landings page. Number three, Jade touched on this as well. Job descriptions should be succinct. Applicants can be dissuaded from applying if they feel they don't meet all of the qualifications. One study showed that men apply for jobs when they check 6 out of 10 boxes on the list of qualifications, while women only applied when they checked off all 10. Take anything out that's not required of the candidate. Organizations often overvalue skills and qualifications that are teachable, or those hard skills, and undervalue skills that are less teachable, soft skills, such as ability to work on a team, communication skills, problem solving, critical thinking. And the distinction between hard and soft can be misleading because many of these so-called soft skills are actually essential for success in almost any role and are often harder to cultivate than the technical skills. Words matter. Use balanced wording to diversify your teams. A study of 4,000 job descriptions found that postings for jobs dominated by men had a high frequency of more stereotypical masculine words such as lead, head, direct, determined, superior. And postings for jobs dominated by women had more balanced words such as collaborative, committed, responsive, self-aware. They found women were more interested in jobs when the description had a balance of words. Number 4, form a diverse hiring team and don't use a person of color as a diversity cover. Often people of color are enlisted to participate in hiring or recruiting committees in an act of contrived diversity, and these people are often tokenized, overburdened, and undervalued. Number 5, screen resumes with names, addresses, and education marked out. In a study of identical resumes, one with a man's name, one with a woman's name, researchers found that 79% of male applicants versus only 49% of female applicants were considered worthy of hire, and the women deemed worthy of hire received $4,000 less in compensation. Check your parental biases and don't devalue resume gaps. Membership in a PTA or taking time off to be a stay-at-home parent or caregiver should not count against the applicant. In another study of identical resumes with one difference, membership in the PTA, researchers found those applicants were 79% less likely to be hired, half as likely to be promoted, and $11,000 less in salary. Number 6, introduce the candidate to employees who may identify in the way that they do, and implement skills-based hiring practices. Going off of what Jade talked about with neurodiversity, this is really important with individuals with communication challenges or different neurological challenges that may not be able to answer questions in a traditional interview style format, and it's not accurately representative of the skills that they're able to accomplish. Number 7, think about your long-term and don't have automatic eliminators. Overly strict criteria for eliminating candidates based on minor issues like a typo or a narrow focus on education can really limit the candidate pool. Maintaining awareness of your hiring process and implementing inclusive practices not only fosters a culturally competent workplace, but contributes to the longevity of employment and the overall success of your organization's bottom line.
So I'm going to talk very briefly about retention. And so we have the same, so you've hired a diverse team. You've used inclusive practices to hire that diverse team. We circle back to inclusion. I have this Venn diagram on the your left-hand side there, and you'll see it's D and I. So it's important that we bring inclusion back in the sense of creating an inclusive work environment where employees feel that they belong for the purpose of retention. Not only for the purpose of retention, but in this context, for the purpose of retention. If you take a look at the image here on the right-hand side, you'll see, a characterization of identity cover. This is, I would argue, the number one issue that stands in the way, the number one barrier for a sense of inclusion and belonging at work. And this is an important thing that we have to work against and this has been iterated over and over again today, so I don't need to go into it, by our panel, by everybody else. The other groups, I think, each touched on the importance of being yourself, being your full self, not masking, not performing, not trying to conform to a norm, but expressing yourself fully, to bring yourself fully to work and want to be there and want to stay there. Here are some practices that I can suggest. We have more resources, so if this is something you want to follow up on, we have a resources sheet, and also these slides have resources in the notes as well. I'm only going to touch on number 1 and number 4. So number 1, this is something I found in the research that repeatedly, which is if you do an environmental scan, if you do a survey, if you do a work culture survey, if you can find minority groups, and I'm not talking just about a single identity. Let's say, for example, a woman who is queer. Find that small group, that interest group, or Black disabled men, that small group. Find these small groups and focus in on what commonalities are there, and see if you can find ways to move the needle in those small groups. And this is how this is really truly a good practice in creating inclusion and belonging at work, and a great utilization of that tool rather than aggregating and finding just overarching issues that you find in the workplace survey. And lastly, manage with humanity. Again, echoing what I heard today, I was elated to hear people talking about how doing these personalized practices and these connected mentorships and sharing these really meaningful experiences we share with each other as people, right? So practice your humanity at work. The one suggestion I'll share is the idea of talking about home and normalizing talking about home. I think sometimes we get away from that. We don't want to personalize. We're afraid to overstep. We want to be professional. But talk about the things that are meaningful to you and your one-on-one with the people you manage. Talk about your cultural practices. Say the sort of celebration you had that weekend. Talk about your pet. Invite them to do the same. We're human. Let's remember that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michelle.
And so we are back to numbers because we're well-rounded. We like the warm fuzzy, but we like our data too. So the bottom line of all of this is turnover is expensive. Reasonable turnover, it's expected, it's healthy, and it's necessary for business. Excessive turnover is expensive and it's disruptive to operations. It is costing companies, U.S. companies, $630 billion a year. And I've actually seen that number getting up to $1 trillion now. So the numbers are shifting and it's getting more expensive. It's a constant moving target. What is this cost to your business? Do you know? While experts do estimate that it costs 33% of an employee's salary to replace them, it can get up to 3 to 4 times their salary to hire a replacement. In addition, employee turnover often leads to a loss of institutional knowledge, and it can negatively impact your company's culture. We are now doing more with less. That's a fact of working now. Recruiting time is time-consuming for the hiring manager, which creates additional losses in productivity because they're spending time looking for replacements to people that have left. Do you have additional time in your day to dedicate to constant hiring and rehiring? I know it's tough for me. Some additional costs of turnover, reduced customer satisfaction and potential loss of customers, loss of organizational knowledge, deferred or lost revenue, overburdening of remaining employees, which then can lead to decreased morale, feeding into a cycle of ever-increasing rates of turnover. The poison apple in the barrel. If you have people that are losing morale, that starts to spread. It is contagious. Can you afford these additional costs and burdens of excessive turnover to your business? By fostering a more equitable and culturally competent workplace, organizations not only create a more positive and inclusive environment for their employees, but also gain strategic advantages that can lead to sustained success and growth. And back to Lene to bring us home.
Thank you all for listening to the words and the data. I hope some of that sunk in for everybody. But to wrap up, I would like us to ask ourselves, how are we going to vet hiring practices to ensure it's up to date with current and inclusive practices? How are we going to create a culture of inclusion and belonging to maximize potential and retention? Remember, an employer of choice is distinguished by its commitment to creating a supportive, inclusive, and rewarding work environment. This involves updating job descriptions, screening resumes without bias, and implementing skills-based hiring practices. Once you make diverse hires, it's crucial to foster a culture of inclusion and belonging by becoming culturally competent. This means understanding, communicating, and effectively interacting with people from various cultures. Thank you once again. Let's work together to build a more equitable and cultural competent workplace.